just being in this room, though, was kind of firing me up to get back into the game and to start talking about politics again. So on that note, here's what's going to happen. I'm going to start with asking a question that every one of you is going to answer. We'll go down the line. And then I'm going to just start winging out questions, and I'd love, maybe I'll get somebody to start, but we'd love for you to all jump in and add whatever you want. No one has to answer everything. And if someone in the crowd feels compelled to sort of pick up particularly on something that's going on in the conversation, feel free to sort of raise your hand. I'll see if I can flag you down and you can yell it out. But certainly at the end, maybe around 10 o'clock-ish, we'll go to questions. So let's start with the first question here, which is, how do you see your role as a journalist covering politics in Massachusetts? What's your primary focus? What stories get you excited? That kind of stuff. Matt, do you mind kicking it off for us?
No, I don't mind kicking off. Can everyone hear me okay?
I feel like, all right. My primary role, covering the State House and politics, you tend to have your hands in a million things at all times. I guess I try to approach it as part accountability for the people that we cover. Part of it's interpretation, a lot of it with politics and with policy of not just focusing on what we think people want to read, but explaining it and sort of emphasizing why this is important and why maybe this is not as important. And I think that's, a lot of things kind of fall into those buckets, but I feel, I'm trying to think of, there's four questions in there. Also, what kind of excites me and what, that it always depends on the time of year, I guess, is a weird way to describe it, where I feel like my life is very different during an election year as opposed to this year. So, which is good. I guess we all kind of like what we do because every day could be a little different. And even, I've been covering the State House for 10 years last month, and there are cycles and there are things I feel like I do over and over again, and then it feels very, very different every year, every day. So, yeah, that's perfect. Yeah.
True confessions, I get Matt Stout Twitter alerts, so no pressure, but you're the person that keeps me updated. Colin, jump right in.
Yeah, so I agree with everything that Matt said. I think working for the State House News Service, I view my job as having a little bit of a unique aspect to it, in that I think part of our job is also not just to tell people what's going on, but to sort of explain why, and to sort of explain the process of how Beacon Hill operates, the ins and outs of that. So at the news service, we get really into the weeds. We cover every session of the legislature, gavel to gavel. So I see part of my job being that explainer of not just what's happening, but why it's happening and what might happen next based on what we've seen in those cycles that Matt mentioned. And everything is sort of like a 2-year cycle. Everything comes up again around the same time each legislative session. So we can use some of that to try to give our readers a sense of what they can expect next. As far as the stories that really excite me and what I focus on most, we don't have really defined beats at the news service, but we all kind of fall into things that we tend to cover more than others in the newsroom. So I cover a lot of the regulated industries things, the energy, and the stuff that really excites me is things that are new and that are just happening. So, for example, I covered the legalization of marijuana, the legalization of sports betting, really kind of the rollout of casino gaming in Massachusetts. And I really like those kinds of stories because they're things that are happening for the first time here. You know, the CCC, the Cannabis Control Commission, was created from whole cloth and had to get up and running. You know, the Gaming Commission had to write regulations for sports betting and get that plane off the ground. So I'm always interested in things like that, and thankfully there are always new topics like that for me to dig into.
Well, the State House News Service is certainly a Bible, as anyone who covers politics knows, so we thank you for what you do. Jennifer, go ahead, and while you're talking, I'm going to turn my phone off, which is ringing in the back. Excuse me.
Okay. I will do my best not to take it personally. We're going to be doing, I think, a improv yes and deal here because yes and everything they said. So my background, as many of you may also know, is in local journalism. So a lot of my priorities and my roles basically come down to whether or not the average person could possibly internalize what a particular policy means for them, what it looks like on the ground. And so really, I see my role as sort of bringing that up to a statewide level as opposed to kind of just digging in on a situation-by-situation basis. We also don't have beats at Commonwealth, so if we were individually trying to cover every single community in Massachusetts, I would never get a lick of sleep in my life, so we can't really do that. But one of the things that I think is very, very critical, and it's not a hot take, but housing has been basically my passion since I started reporting, and it continues to be my passion. I love data dives on where people live, where they're moving, and why they're doing that, and that's been particularly topical recently because I don't know if you've heard, there might have been something of an exodus that we're experiencing for a few different reasons. So I think that my role and many of our roles is not just to interpret things in kind of a macro sense, but also try and be as illustrative as possible and say, when a policy changes, here's how you might see it actually roll out. And the thing that really gets me up in the morning is figuring out why a building is going up near me.
Azita.
I'll start yes and as well because I agree with everything that was said before. At GBH, our operation is pretty small. We have beat reporters. We have, you guys all know Katie Lannon. She's an excellent, excellent reporter who covers the State House for us. And we have Saraya Wintersmith, who's been covering City Hall for us. And we have Adam Riley, who's more the general assignment politics person. And so we do have the beat reporters, but I've only been on the job for about a month or so. But one of the visions I have and one of the things I'm trying to do is soften the lines of the beat a little bit because we're really lucky. We subscribe to State House News, so we already have access, and our audience has access to some of the great reporting that happens that informs people of what's happening on the State House level and in terms of policy and all that. So what we're trying to do is take some of those big stories, such as housing and policy around housing and homelessness and the cost of living here in general and people leaving Massachusetts because it's too expensive, is to look at how the policies impact the general public. Our constituency, our audience, is not necessarily the hashtag #MAPauley audience. Our audience is a little bit of everybody. So we have to distill the information and make it relevant and report on it in a way that's really relevant to the man on the street, so to speak, the person on the street. In terms of what excites me, it's hard to tell because there's a lot of stuff that's going on around the state that's really, it's a vibrant state, and a lot of the policy issues are really important ones. Like you said, cannabis and gaming and housing and all the things that my esteemed colleagues have already mentioned. So, you know, we just take it one day at a time and try to figure out what is going to be the big story of today and how are we going to report on it so that people understand how it relates to them. But the other thing I want to say is politics goes beyond. When I was talking about politics to someone else, I said politics is not just about policy and about what happens at the State House or at City Hall or wherever in government agencies. It's what happens at schools, it's what happens at community meetings, it's what happens on the street when organizations are fighting for certain rights, for certain things. So we really want to keep an eye and an ear out for a lot of the on-the-ground level stuff that's happening and inform our reporting based on what is it people are really interested in and what is it that upsets them. We did, just so you know, we did a thing where, you know, Maura Healey, new in office, and we reached out across the state. We have a sister station in Western Massachusetts. We reached out to see what do people want Maura Healey to focus on? What do people want her to be working on? And we informed a lot of our reporting on the research that we did. We solicited people to, elicited call-ins from people to get an idea. So it's a give and take.
And you have great institutional knowledge of what's going on in the state too, Azita, so it's great to have you here. Steph, you're up.
Got it. So my approach to this has changed at different news outlets, and I feel like I'm able to do this more than ever. But two things really inform my approach. One, as a plebeian, I definitely try to look at policy and politics from the perspective of my fellow plebeians and trying to distill this in terms that everyone can understand. And I know it's a common refrain to say, you know, is this something you're going to tell your friend at the bar? But I also like to think of it as, is this something that your mom's going to text you or that you're going to have the energy to understand because you're exhausted juggling work and family and all of these things, especially post or during this pandemic. So there's that. The other thing I would say, and this is maybe especially in Massachusetts, especially in the climate we're in now, whether it's migration or immigration, whether it's sports betting or some other policies coming down, whether it was under Baker or now Healy, a lot of what I like to focus on is the racial or ethnic equity lens through which a lot of these policies are being debated, especially when there's so many promises being made now on Beacon Hill from our congressional delegation across Massachusetts about that being embedded in some of these policy debates. There's only two of us, myself and my esteemed colleague, Mike Dean. So there's a lot we can't get to and a lot we think about that we wish we could get to, but you know, there's also a beauty in being able to tell people definitively, here are the things you need to know as you're getting out of bed and trying to be a person in the morning. And some of that is also the beauty of not really always having to compete with our colleagues, but also spotlight their great work in our newsletter. And so, yeah, that's kind of the approach I try to take these days as a reporter.
Awesome. Thanks, Steph. Jimmy.
I would like to jump in just on Steph's last point and publicly thank her. Some months ago, she named me as one of the top 5 influential people in Massachusetts. And so when she talked, that's a demonstration of shared promotion and shared highlighting. My name is James Jimmy Hills. I'm the host of Java with Jimmy. I often say, and I've said it to a few people today, I am not a journalist. I run from that title. I'm doing better with being the media. I consider myself community media. I'm going to do something very funny and just ask you to re-ask the question again, just to make sure I cover everything.
No, absolutely. So we're just, you know, how do you see your role? So maybe not as a journalist, but covering politics.
Yes.
Obviously, you do a lot with your community.
Yes.
And, you know, what gets you excited?
Okay. I see my role currently, and it started, just so you know, I just went live one day because Charlie Baker said we needed to stay home. And everything that we saw exacerbated in Black and brown communities from my time of service to community, I went and grabbed my usual cup of coffee and sat in front of my iPhone and went live on Facebook. And I've been known to go live here and there through the years, not so polished as I am now, but often spoke out of my trauma sometimes as the result of some policies in, you know, long-term and more recent policies. And that began with just trying to help my community get ready for COVID. It's evolved. I see my role now, it's evolved into a lot of what these folks here have said, breaking down the policy in a layman's terms, understanding the impact on the everyday life of the policy. But I think it's also twofold because I find myself often liaising a conversation between a Maura, between a Michelle, but then communicating back to them what I'm seeing in the comments. Some of you may know I'm now a fellow person at GBH, and one of the things that was attractive to them was that community engagement. And so I see my role as, yes, from the time in Menino's office, there's a couple of folks in here from the Menino or back in the day, Menino alum. I see it really also humanizing our elected officials. I think often we disagree with policy, and especially here of late, as you mentioned, the level of for lack of better words, protesting in the way that some people may demonize someone because there's a difference in policy. At the end of the day, we are all humans. And so I also see my role in my ability to have a different conversation with these elected officials, not saying that my colleagues and peers can't, but also from my life experience, there's just a different lens in which I'm going to ask questions. Finally, I will say, what excites me, I definitely move in some areas of politics, but there's a health component to Java with Jimmy as well. And I think the number one thing, and I feel my chest getting tight when I say it, the number one thing that stands out to me is when in our health segment, someone mentioned that they saw the segment about breast cancer and they went and got their mammogram. And people have got into treatment. I guess in this lens of policy, people have got connected with services through the show. And so I think the thing that gets me up in the morning, I'll be very transparent, is I feel a huge sense, all right, I'm gonna keep myself together, responsibility to my community to ensure that those that don't wanna watch the regular news, those that feel that the news is so negative, to be able to keep them informed and also communicate their voice to those that I have on the platform.
Certainly the kind of, I won't say journalism, but interaction that was not even available to communities 15, 20 years ago. So it's really interesting to hear your thoughts. I'm kind of curious to know if there is any stories that you find are sort of bubbling up on the horizon, untapped, that you think is sort of the next frontier, that you're, this might be getting you to disclose state secrets or something, but like, is there something you're looking toward? What, there's been big issues with climate change, DEI, over the past decade or, years, whatever. Anything that's coming up that you guys are keeping, and maybe, there may be nothing and we'll move on, but just curious.
Well, I'd say one thing that comes to mind, maybe it's more of a theme than just one story, but is the everything that we're hearing now about competitiveness in Massachusetts. I've been covering the State House for 8 years this summer, and competitiveness really wasn't something that was talked about for about the first 6.5 years that I was doing this. And, it's coming about now at a time when Massachusetts has adopted the income surtax. There's a new governor after 8 years, so there's a change there. The new governor, Maura Healey, is obviously trying to position or to frame Massachusetts's competitiveness differently than the last administration would have done it. So to me, that's something that's been emerging in the last year or so.
And when you say competitiveness, Colin, explain what you're talking about.
Massachusetts's ability to attract people to live here, to work here, to keep people who come to school here, to get them to stay and work in Massachusetts. The pandemic obviously allowed people to move all over the country and work remotely, so people could still work for Massachusetts companies without having to live in Massachusetts. And that has a big impact on the state's finances, just to name one thing. So I think that's a theme that is starting to bubble up a lot more than it has in the last handful of years, at least.
If I could jump in on that as well, one thing that I've noticed is now there is basically a two-hander in the way that the administration has basically been pitching Massachusetts in terms of competitiveness, the favored buzzword right now. And one of them is basically in the areas of reproductive care access. And so I've been particularly fascinated by the way that now whenever there's an announcement rolling out or whenever there's a policy discussion that's being rolled out, the framework now is either this will help attract people to Massachusetts and keep them in Massachusetts, or emphasize kind of Massachusetts's reputation as not just a presumed liberal bastion, which I assume we'll talk about at some point, but that also, that what comes with that is kind of a set of policy proposals and beliefs and protections that you can really kind of tie into anything. And the way I would illustrate this is a story from this week about tying data privacy, whether or not your cell phone apps can sell your data to third parties through the lens of, does this allow people to track whether or not you're going to visit an abortion clinic, for instance? But it can also mean, can people track where active military is overseas? So the way that it's pitched on Beacon Hill is in protecting reproductive care access, which I think is tied directly into the way that Maura Healey specifically has been trying to market Massachusetts as competitive.
Absolutely. There's one line saying Massachusetts isn't competitive enough, and it's often framed around taxes
Exactly.
and cost of living. And Maura Healey has really taken this tact of, we're competitive, we can attract people because of the programs that we have, the services that we have, the rights and freedoms that we have in Massachusetts, for sure.
You have someone who told us a few years ago that reproductive rights would be sort of a corner office issue, agenda item. We'd say that's crazy. But anyway, Edie, were you going to jump in?
Yeah, I was just going to say, we actually sent Adam Riley to follow Maura Healey to Ireland because of that very issue. Because
Thank you, Adam.
I know. He's been working so hard. We thought the time difference was going to be to his benefit, but that only means he wakes up at 8 a.m. and goes to bed at 1 a.m. But anyway, but it's because Maura Healey is not just nationally trying to pitch Massachusetts with this values-driven pitch of us being progressive or being a certain way with, inclusive with the LGBTQ community and reproductive rights, but she's taking that message internationally. So we thought it was really interesting to see how she's positioning herself, and whether or not Ireland latches on to that or if other countries latch on, it's almost inconsequential in a sense, because what she's really trying to do is amplify that message, and by doing it internationally, she's really also amplifying it for a national audience. So I do see the conflict between this values-driven pitch and the reality on the ground that it is expensive to live here, and that Massachusetts is not Boston is not very hospitable to young people. So many young people come for universities. I mean, we've been talking for probably a century about how we're the hub of higher education, but yet look at how many people end up having to leave. They can't really make a career here in Massachusetts, not because necessarily there aren't good jobs to be had, but because it's just the conflict of trying to buy a house and have a standard of living becomes too much. And I've been doing this for a while, not on the politics realm, but I was a producer for Greater Boston, and I can't tell you how many discussions we had on the show about young people leaving Boston. And this has been going on for a long time, and I just think now with the flexibility the pandemic has given us in terms of work from home, it's kind of brought it all to a head, because people are leaving and employers are trying to get people back into the office, and nobody wants to deal with the traffic. The MBTA and the traffic around Massachusetts is also a huge, huge issue. And I'm interested to see how this is all going to play out. That's one of the focus areas we have, which I need to mention. We have a really great MBTA, Bob C., who covers the MBTA for us and is like on top of all that stuff. Little plug there.
So I think for many people, professions, people like to know what goes on behind the scenes. They like to peel back the curtain and see what's going on. So I'm curious to know how you all go about finding stories, finding scoops. This is a competitive, certainly political, journalistic culture in Massachusetts and Boston. I know I used to advocate just for a day to go to the State House and not do anything, not have to be on the air at 6 o'clock, just hang out and talk to people. And inevitably, I came out with a little snippet of something that I could turn into a story. But I'm wondering what you all do. And if anyone wants to jump in here, go for it.
If I could just chime in on a different perspective about what was previously said.
Sorry.
One of the things when Governor Healey came on, she actually dropped the news on the show, was that she's being very intentional when you talk about competitiveness, and folks have mentioned the exodus. There was a story that came out, I don't remember who put the story out, but black folks are leaving, I believe it was Boston, but it may have been Massachusetts. And so I think one of the things that we'll look at in the next few months, a year or so, post the NAACP convention coming to Boston, in a post-George Floyd period, with the Healy administration being very intentional around data about who is using resources and services with what's going on in Nubian Square, that development. We have the Greater Roxbury Arts and Cultural Center coming. BECMA is doing a lot at the state level to ensure basically paying attention to the real results of the buzzword DEI type of influence at the state house, at the legislative level, but I think also in a cultural level here in Massachusetts. I'm Boston-based, but here in Massachusetts, I think with that competitiveness, the Healy administration, I've seen just a different sort of cadence and being very intentional about highlighting the importance of inclusiveness around not just Black and brown, but all marginalized communities, definitely LGBTQ, which I'm a part of, but just generally, I think that's something that we're going to see a lot of. I mean, I may be covering it in others, but seeing that intentionality. To just answer quickly behind the scenes and getting stories, I'll be very honest and transparent. There isn't a process. I'm in the process now. I've just started working with the Davis system, and they're taking some operations and management for me, but it's really driven by a lot sometimes if I see something on Twitter, but most of the time it is driven from texts and inboxes on social media where folks are like, the most recent one is, Jimmy, are you going to cover what went on in BPS with 32-year-old woman? And so it's really based off of community. The day-to-day is organized chaos as literally a one-man show. I respect and envy all of you for your wonderful teams. With GBH, I do have a...
Also organized chaos, just so you know.
But at least you have other people that are in the chaos with you. And I have some as well, but I just, to answer that question, behind the scenes and day to day, it is really community driven based on what I'm hearing from the pulse of community.
Thank you for that, Jimmy. Matt, were you going to jump in on just finding scoops and how you go about?
Oh, I was going to say it's
generating-
incredibly boring from day to day if I had to explain it to you. I mean, literally going through like public records, and knowing where to look, going through documents. I mean, I at the end of the day, like my wife asked me like what I did today, and like I literally think I don't know how much she'll like tunes out after a few minutes because beyond
doesn't even ask.
Yeah, beyond telling her like what stories I wrote, but like the process, like how it was ever made into like a movie like Spotlight, just like blows my mind because it is. It is so much of just wading through things and maybe finding like literally like. Finding a truffle in the dirt and then picking up and making that into something. And a lot of it's just building off of what the reporting you do, where, I mean, doing like a small story and then, someone reaches out with a tip or, there's a string to sort of, pull on from that. I mean, a lot of it is, and usually the best stories are building off of something small and, having it growing both in scope, but also finding different ways to sort of explore different issues. So, yeah, it's like I love it, but I don't know the day to day. I don't know if just going through OCPF campaign finance records is anyone's bag, but
That's kind of listen.
it's mine.
OCPF is kind of fun. That part I enjoy that part.
Have you ever said to Frank Phillips, "Give me all your contacts"?
Yeah, well, so yeah, I follow Frank on Twitter, and I'm like, every time I see him tweet, I'm like, why didn't Frank just call me with this? Man, you're not, you're just enjoying retirement, but
Do you, Matt? Will you get just a call and say, "Look, Matt, I want to give you this"? And
what, from Frank or from anybody?
No, from anybody.
For anybody?
I mean, is that a big aspect of how you get stories, or is it?
I
detect that you're digging around a lot more than people probably realize.
I wouldn't say it's a big aspect. That it's always nice where you feel like something sort of drops in your lap, but I feel like part of that is because I covered something. Someone sees it and they're like, hey, you were digging into this. I thought you'd be interested. So, I mean, it's one thing, even when I always talk to someone who's just getting into journalism or how to get into a new beat, it's just write the crap out of it. Get your name out there on stories and write as much as you can because it's a foundation you build up. And that's at least how I sort of approach it. So
Such good advice. Steph.
Wholeheartedly agree 100%. However, I will say I'm in the minority, and I hope many of us are here, of people who love that boring work of sifting through public records. So,
God love you.
sorry. But yeah, honestly, and I know a lot of you folks already do this, but you, your neighbors, your friends calling us, like, that's so huge. And as many times as we might say no, or this isn't a right fit for us, like, it doesn't mean we don't want to hear from you, of course. That is super important. Of course, in my case, I'm hearing or trying to reach out to a combination of folks, whether they're lobbyists, whether they're small business owners, people, individuals on the street. In my case, because we are covering more than policy and politics, I will be trying to reach out to folks I find locally who might have an interesting or compelling TikTok video or Instagram story. If there's some nugget of news there or an issue worth exploring, that doesn't always turn into a story, but it does help build relationships, especially with people on the ground who are experiencing a lot of these policy issues firsthand. So I will say, in addition to looking through public records, there's that. And, you know, sometimes there's an opportunity to do some of those follow-ups. They might not be huge scoops, but, you know, like you said, Matt, sometimes you write the first story and people come back to you. This is more of a local minor, I don't want to say minor because it's an awful subject, scoop. But, you know, I wrote a story 2 or 3 years ago about Ollie's Law being introduced, and some of the individuals associated with that, they remembered that and they reached out to me and let me know, hey, this owner who was, you know, sort of unfortunately, or this business owner who was associated with the situation was the impetus for this law, has been cited after a dog died in her care. So sometimes those stories come out. It might be a few years later, but we're still listening and sort of engaging in those types of tips as well.
Awesome.
One thing that's been, I think, extremely helpful to all of us during the pandemic is also the expansion of virtual hearings, where a lot of our jobs pre-pandemic involved just running physically to every hearing you could actually get to. And so now having the opportunity to say, well, look, I'm based in Boston. If I wanted to get out to, you know, the Cape to cover an environmental hearing, I could do that, but I would have to reorient my entire day around that. And so having both the clarity of a lot of these hearings and a lot of these meetings that we would already kind of love to drop in on, but don't always have the ability to do that, presented online and available online, and then it's easy to follow up with people, has been, I think, a real blessing, not just for journalists, but also I think we all hear repeatedly from people that they are able to kind of drop in on something while they are, for instance, taking care of kids at home. They can listen to these committee meetings that before they would have to reorient around. So that's been, I hope, you know, an ongoing but extremely valuable tool from the pandemic.
Such a good point. I'm really kind of curious to know how much pressure you all feel, if any, to have a big headline or beef up a story that may not be that sexy. Now, I would never do that, but seriously, we've all been to those hearings or that press conference and walked away and then saw the report, the headline, and someone, you know, you kind of said, is that the way that went down? And, you know, someone, that was like a teeny part of that. Like, I wouldn't say that. How much do you feel that pressure, I gotta beef this up, if at all? Colin, do you feel it?
Well, I actually sort of don't feel that, maybe, or at least maybe not as much as some others. Unsexy is kind of what we do at the news service. So
Excellent point.
you know, sometimes what might not fly as a headline in other outlets is like right up our readers' alleys. So, you know, we kind of keep that in mind. But there is always, if not pressure, at least the thought that, you know, I want people to click on this and open it and read it. So I want there to be a good, strong headline on it. But I don't know that it's pressure necessarily. Just more of, you know, geez, I put a lot of work into this. I'd like people to actually get around to reading it.
I have to say, when you have limited resources, and I came from a commercial television background before moving to GBH, when you when there are limited resources and you've already spent some resources on a story, the bosses get really upset when you say, oh yeah, after spending 10 hours on this, it's nothing. So there is that pressure, but that doesn't necessarily mean we succumb to it all the time, right? In fact, we try not to, but there's always a pressure to deliver on have a return on investment, so to speak, for the time you've spent on a story. But I have to say, we try to fight that. We try to fight it internally within our own organization, because it's a beast that you have to constantly feed. When you have newscasts, you have to constantly have material to feed newscasts. When you have broadcasts, you have to have constant material to feed. Or when you have publications that have to come out, you need to fill them. So you just have to figure out, is this worthy of going into the publication, into the broadcast, or not? And you just have to kind of fight the forces, fight the power.
Do you all feel? Oh, sorry, please.
As far as pressure, I do feel a sense of pressure when you talk about presentation, because often, because of life, a lot of people aren't going to tune in. For example, yesterday I had the mass budget and voter table folks on. And in my case, you all may look at views or whatever, how many people click on a story after you publish it or whatever. In my case, my live, the numbers are there in real time. Some days it's 28. Since folks have gone back to work, it's dropped. Yesterday, I think I had dropped down to like 9 people watching. And so for me, the pressure is in ensuring that I put something out there in the flyer, in the advertisement, to let folks know, hey, this is important information. Come in, and why it's important. But because of the percentage of the population that I tend to cater to, or my audience, is that population that really needs the information, but life sometimes often causes them not to be able to tune in. So there is a different sort of pressure, I believe in my case, to ensure that I get people in the room, as I say.
Right. I mean, you mentioned budgets. It's certainly in a TV newsroom, and your news director's eyes glaze over. And so it's kind of our responsibility to pick something out of that budget and explain why that is so critically important to people and make it come to life.
Absolutely.
Matt.
Yeah, Brian McGrory, while he was editor at the Globe, kind of like started like a mantra a little bit, where he wanted the Globe to be not the paper of record, but the paper of interest. Mm-hmm. And that sort of, I guess has sort of like shaped my view of covering it, because one, because I'm lucky, because the State House News, I know there's, if I'm not following every little bit, I can by reading the State House News, so it gives me a little flexibility. But yeah, I think if you're operating from a place where you're finding interesting stories and finding important stories, not covering things because you feel like you need to, maybe it's not so much pressure with a big headline, but like I think that's how, at least I know the whole time I've been at the Globe, it's been the approach. Like finding interesting, important stories, and not feeling like you just, we're not covering the budget because we have to. We're covering the budget because it's important, and we're trying to find the things that really, affect people that matter. So, yeah.
If I could pick up on a thread that Jimmy raised earlier, which is kind of the question of positivity or negativity. I think one of the pressures that we deal with a lot is the only news story when everything is going wrong. And that can often be the best use of resources if you don't have very many of those resources. You kind of want to let people know, hey, you might see something desperately inconvenience you, the tea is currently on fire. You do want to probably write about that, and not necessarily, now it might actually be news if you make it through all of a red line and everything goes fine. But one instance would be, for instance, the mass health reevaluations that are happening right now. It's very easy to focus purely on how many people might be booted, but then the question is, do you have the time, the resources, and the capacity to follow up later and say, well, how is it going? And if it's going well, is that also news? Because maybe you don't expect state government to work all the time. Yep. So that would be one thing as well, where it's not necessarily the big headline, but do we think that the only big headlines are when something is going wrong?
So I knew time was going to fly with this. I want to get to questions shortly, but I have a couple more questions that I want to get in. I want to talk about transparency. or perhaps the lack thereof in state and local government. Certainly, Beacon Hill is not known for being an open book, which can obviously make things challenging for all of us. So, are there any thoughts on that? And how do you develop relationships with government officials, communications professionals, who can give you some of that information? Anyone jump in?
So one thing I will say is I'm very grateful for records access officers and spokespeople who understand or who are open to having conversations like total human beings. And I know that sounds maybe odd, but reporters sometimes struggle with, going past the I'm on deadline, I need this right now, and just having those human conversations. And I also find increasingly, depending on the spokesperson, that can be difficult on your end or their end too, because there's a lot that's being juggled. But I have found luck with RAOs and spokespeople who are willing to build those relationships and then aren't paranoid when I'm asking for information they might not be happy about or records that are late. So I think that has been very helpful for me. Does it always work? No. Do I sometimes have spokespeople who will accuse me of being a bad journalist for pulling up a record they didn't want me to? Yes, but guess what? Reporters talk, and they'll know if you start doing that. So that said, it really is, for me, it's crucial to pick up the phone. And maybe it's not, someone who's currently in that government position. Maybe it's someone who left or who is, a firm that's affiliated with that agency. But even just being willing to ask a reporter a question about, hey, like, why are these records important? Or what do you want to see, not only in the reporting that's related to your clients, but also in some of these issues that, require difficult and uncomfortable questions.
I think on the relationship thing, the fortunate thing, and I'll bring it back local with the Mayor Michelle Wu's office, is we sat less than Matt is away from each other when she was an intern for Mayor Menino. And so there is a different type of relationship there that, how can I say this where I don't get in trouble, that during the campaign, folks knew that though I was going to hold accountable, if any, it was quote unquote friendly fire. I was saying to someone earlier, before Java with Jimmy, I had a social media presence more in an activist space. And it was a little more passionate than what the presentation is now. If you do some research a few years ago, you might see some videos and say, oh, wow, Jimmy has really evolved a lot. One of the things that we were talking about is I have learned, when you talk about transparency in those relationships with the comms people, I have learned accountability, and this isn't a word that we hear a lot in this space, but love. When you talk about humanity, I have learned to hold people accountable in love because I see their humanity. I don't agree with your policy issue, but I'm able to ask you about it in a manner where you don't feel like I'm cussing you out, just to keep it very plain. And so I think that that's one of the things that allows me to be very honest, a certain level of access. There's going to be accountability, but it's going to be presented in a manner of love, but also the humanity of the person that I'm holding accountable, because at the end of the day, we don't know all the information that these elected officials have that isn't public, that we haven't got access to yet. We don't know, unfortunately, some of our electeds whose motive is to improve the quality of life for people. I was telling someone yesterday, a factor in their decision-making around supporting a bill or doing something with policy, politics comes up in that. Am I going to do something that's going to cause me to lose votes? Am I going to do something that's going to cause a PAC to come out against me? And so I think that's one of the things that must be taken into consideration when we have these relationships, to be able to get access to those that make decisions in this political arena.
Thank you, Jimmy. Yeah.
I just wanted to add, I love what you say, especially about love and humanity. And I want to add, obviously the common thread has been relationships and relationship building, and a big part of it is trust. and we have to stick to our word as journalists when we say something and when we promise something, and build that kind of trust with the sources that we have, in order for them to be willing to open up to us. And that not just government sources, but people who are going through very personal things, or people who are going through things that might expose them to harm in some way. So I know you guys are going to get really tired of me doing this, but I'm going to shout out Sarah Betancourt over there, because she's one of our great reporters who does a lot of work in the immigrant and refugee communities, for example. And the only way she gets some of the information she gets is by just doggedly talking to people and building that kind of trust. Sorry, Sarah.
Not to mention that rent pad story is still ingrained in my mind.
So one more quick one. Maybe you could all jump in, or a couple you could jump in quickly on this, because I'm just curious. I'd like to know your thoughts about Massachusetts as a one-party state. What are there, a couple of dozen Republicans now at the State House, if that? How is that a challenge, and how much responsibility do you feel to report on diverse or more conservative political views that are not maybe held in this state, but are held all over the country, pretty strongly, and certainly, but yeah. Does anyone have any thoughts about that?
I'll give what might be kind of a weird answer to it, which is I'm a California native, and then I also spent a lot of my life, and my mom still lives in Utah. So I've spent a lot of time in different versions of what are essentially one-party states. And a thing that's always struck me while being here in Massachusetts and reporting here is that we jump to the idea that something is kind of a conservative position or a liberal position very quickly, and part of that has to do with how dramatically partisanship has evolved in the last decade. And one thing that I always try and keep in mind is to check that instinct. One example would be writing about the driver's license bill for immigrants, or in-state tuition for unauthorized immigrants or undocumented students. Those seem like those might be kind of full stop, this is going to break on partisan grounds. Utah feels very, very strongly about maintaining its access to allowing undocumented people to have the opportunity to have driver's licenses, for instance. So, and Texas is a state that cares a lot about maintaining its in-state tuition policy for undocumented students. So that's my kind of unhelpful answer, which is that partisanship doesn't always look like you'd expect it to nationally once you actually break it down into a state-by-state dynamic.
Good point.
I just want to jump in and say it really is a damn shame that this is such a one-party state, in the sense that when you have a robust system where there are multiple parties, there's a checks and balances that happens. And because we don't have that in this state, I think the burden falls on journalists to do some of the checks and balances that would normally, naturally happen in sessions and in public discourse. So I do think it impacts us on how we do the job. And yes, I worry about us being an echo chamber of only one view. And obviously, it's a complex issue, how you bring in all the other views, and the whataboutism that is, you have to be really careful about how you approach it.
Anyone else on that? One more stuff?
Yeah, I will say, while my counterpart does more of the sort of politics coverage, and I focus more on policy, comparatively, I do think there's just so many challenges, because you have people who would have spoken up under Healey's predecessor, but maybe don't feel comfortable doing that right now. And so that's kind of one of the challenges, at least when it comes to on-the-record discussions. And it's not just at the state level with Healey. We see it at the city level with city council, with some other entities as well. So that can be a challenge. But aside from that, one of the things I try to keep in mind, or that some folks might remind me when we're doing interviews and discussions, is how many of these issues that can be deemed controversial really are not sort of Republican Democrat issues. Just think about how many Democrats or moderate Democrats are actually opposed to driver's licenses and maybe just came around now and because they were being led by their constituents, or they say that. And it took, getting the House Speaker bought into this idea for them to sort of fall in place with the driver's license bill, or gender affirming care and other LGBTQ protections being so slow to really just be fully protected and fully recognized, even in the city of Boston, through only until like the last decade or two. And so there are a lot of examples where, maybe we think it's partisan because of that sort of partial myth of the liberal bastion, but there's so many things and so many sort of cracks that reveal a much more complex fabric of where everyone stands on various issues. And yeah, I think it can be lazy to just assume it's a partisan issue here.
Okay, I do want to jump into questions quick, and I'm a little late to the game, but wow, right in front of me. Thank you very much. Why don't you get up? I don't think we have a mic, but maybe you could just, you don't. If you want to say your name and who you're with, that would be great.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. I'm Kelly Chun. I have a public relations and marketing business based in Roxbury. We focus on multicultural marketing. We're also a strategic partner to Dentraline. I'm going to ask the AI question. What is your relationship to AI? I know the Globe has done some AI generated stories with full transparency, particularly with regard to politics, and misinformation, disinformation. What kind of guardrails do you have in place to kind of navigate the AI space?
So it's a question about AI, misinformation, disinformation. How do you navigate? Anyone want to jump in on this?
Simply, I don't touch it. I've been scared to. My capacity has really made me consider trying it. And I just, the integrity of you can go back and edit and whatnot, but it's not coming from the essence of our awareness of information. It's not to discredit anyone that's using it, but I think for me, I just haven't been able to bring myself to get an app and try it.
I kind of love this question because about a month ago, I had a discussion with the head of the UMass Boston Center for Ethics and Technology, and specifically looking at the way that AI isn't likely to turn into a Skynet situation anytime soon, but does contribute to what he called the small erosion of moral choices, which is essentially kind of that germ of maybe what a story is, or that first thing that you start pursuing. So what has been interesting to me in AI and journalism spaces is it works really well for something like market analysis. You can have AI generate something pretty consistently explaining some basic movements in the market. But my concern is when, like in the case of native advertising, when the blur between what is something that is either not really being supervised with a human touch or is being produced with some kind of underlying motive is not labeled or disclosed clearly. So from a disinformation perspective, it's, double, triple check that the image that you're seeing can be corroborated in lots of other places. And from a journalism production side, it's make sure that you are double checking every instinct that an AI technique, product, methodology might suggest to you, because it could be replicating either systemic inequities or certain biases that already exist.
Talk about new frontier journalism. That's definitely on that list. Any other questions? In the back there with glasses on.
Hi, my name is Gerald Duquette. I'm a student at Massachusetts Politics. I was wondering if you had to give 2 or 3 bits of information or advice to a brand new politics beat reporter at the State House about Massachusetts politics, about how it's actually kind of very different than politics in other states, even in other so-called one-party states. What would be the 1 or 2 or 3 things you'd want that new reporter to understand about Massachusetts politics so that they could hit the ground running?
This might not be, I think it's helpful, but if it's not, I understand. Massachusetts is, I think, the worst state, or one of the worst states when it comes to public records. It's one of the only states, maybe still the only state, that has the judiciary, the legislature, and the governor's office shielded from public records. And so there's a lot of stuff that could lend itself to political intrigue, campaigns that we don't see the light of day of, thanks to those exemptions.
Good one.
I think the thing that I would recommend to someone in that position would be to go back and read the history, read archives, because I know I made this comment to a few people this morning that almost nothing on Beacon Hill is brand new. A lot of this has happened before in different situations or in slightly different ways. The big one is last summer's 62F tax rebates, which took me by surprise. That story was broken by Bruce Moll, who's been covering Beacon Hill for decades, and had covered, I believe, the passage or the implementation of that law in the late 1980s. So, having that history was really helpful in that situation. And it, took 30-something years for it to come back up, but sure enough, it came back up. So I think trying to get a grasp on what has already happened would be really helpful.
And when in doubt, bother Bruce Moll at Commonwealth.
Yeah, that's a good, just having that history, knowing, maybe reading
Just
a
a
book
plug.
about the history of busing, knowing about the Kennedys, a little bit about that history, knowing about the fact that Massachusetts sends a disproportionate number of, or it churns out a disproportionate number of presidential candidates. Why is that? There's so much history that's really helpful, and it's a state where institutional knowledge is particularly helpful, I think, in knowing how to cover news. Anybody else?
Having an in, and I think the central theme, relationships. Who was your in Massachusetts politics? One of the things, Boston Poly and Mass Poly, is it's about who you know. It's just one of the relationships and the trust. It really is about who you know in an entry level. So find out who your in is, and relationships with maybe not directly the elected officials, but I think a couple of folks talked about it. Who is the special assistant? Who is the deputy director of this? Having those getting it in and developing those relationships would, I believe, improve your access.
Good question. Right here, this woman.
Hi, I'm Nancy Sterling from ML Strategies at NIMS. Good morning. Wondering how you see the differences between covering the Baker administration versus covering the Healy administration.
Still trying to figure that out. We're only about 6 months in here. But no, I mean, there's, I think, and I honestly, being all honest, I think even there's still getting people in place with Healy, and the people that are in place make a difference in terms of, just how they engage with the media, sort of what they're emphasizing. I'm trying to think at what point, because at 6 months into Baker, we were so focused on the MBTA and it blowing up, and sort of what we were writing about or watching him doing was something that, at least as of December 2014, we had no plans of doing. So even as I've covered the Healy administration, I've tried to look back at the coverage and just find those parallels. So I wish I had a really good answer for you. I guess wait for the first really bad thing to happen under Healy and see how she responds and see what the difference
all those
is.
Crises that first few months, so there was so much to to cover.
Yeah, and I feel like with Healy, it's as opposed to that, a lot more time to get your footing, lay out your agenda, what things are important to you. It's covering a totally different pace of an administration, because it was for Baker early on, how is he going to put out this fire? And with Healy, it's we're talking about the things she campaigned on, the tax relief and this competitive issue. It's that's been at the forefront, and partly because there's outside the tea being on fire, there hasn't been sort of this major thing sort of sucking up the oxygen. So that I think has maybe been the biggest difference I've seen, because it's just you're covering sort of just a different pace of what an administration is trying to do 6 months in.
Anybody else on that one?
They've been more engaging. The Healy administration, sometimes slow, as Matt said, that they're getting people in place in their comms office, but they have been more engaging, though sometimes slow. They've been more engaging. They are intentional often around quality, certain comms folks from DPH, certain things of the Mass Health piece. They have reached out to say, hey, we want to make sure you have this information. Also, would you mind getting it out to the community? So they have been a little more engaging than the former. But I wasn't as, well, I had about a 2-year period with Baker, but I never had him on, so I'll just leave that there.
There's always the future. Who else? Okay, right here.
Hi, my name is Carol Eames. I work with Better Future Project. We are a mitigation and adaptation climate space that works very locally. And I'm wondering, because we're in a time when local newspapers and news are dying, and so all of the news that we're trying to break is coming to the top versus being able to be told at the local level, is there any efforts underway to kind of uplift those local stories more intentionally? I know that GBH was just awarded $6 million, and I wondered, is there any thoughts about even re-granting that to some of the local newspapers? Because it can't all be at the top. We have to be able to understand what's going on locally. The pipeline that goes directly to the State House is generally from City Council, school committees, mayors. So I just wonder if there are any efforts underway to kind of pivot to uplift those local stories.
Well, it helps to have Axios money, I'll tell you that. I think and I can't speak for, the other outlets here, but what's worked really well with our newsletter, even though it's just a year old, is that there's sort of flexibility for those hyperlocal stories as well as the state policy stories. So because we're still sort of getting our bearings, we're still trying to figure that out, but we are sort of getting more of a mix in now. Yes, that's only two people in the Axios Boston newsletter, but it is at least another avenue that exists, in addition to whether it's something of the size of GBH or the Globe or something hyperlocal like, I don't know, Cambridge Day or Universal Hub, because I know those options do exist, whether they have what their budget situation looks like or how they can get, some grant money. I don't know. Hopefully there are some options that some folks can discuss here, but at least, that's a new avenue that exists on our end.
And while I don't have the power to disperse that $6 million, I wish I did. I do know that part of the mission and agenda for that money is to actually use it to create more community spaces for organizations and people to be able to bring their voices and to help lift the stories that we are able to do to platforms and other places, just to distribute it more widely. But I do wish, you raise a really good point. It's sad to see so many local papers just gone. Yeah.
One of the things that, it may not be a favorable fact here, but how community, and you have to break down generations and whatnot, are getting their news information, it's changing. It's changed. It's not necessarily so much in the print anymore, not as much as it used to be. And so there is a level of adaptation that the outlets have to do. I remember some years ago, a picture came up on a reminder. If you remember, there was this thing about print versus pixels with the Globe. And I think that was the first iteration of the industry realizing that, hey, we might have to take another look. One of the things, just to talk about, I'm now not 100%, 99.9% a part of the GBH family. I'm a living example of what was just said. This is the North Star vision for GBH. GBH News will be transformed into one cohesive, audience-focused, multi-platform news organization that tells the most interesting and distinctive local stories of the day, infused and informed by the diverse communities we serve. That, whether print, whether pixel, I think will keep us relevant. I also want to, while thinking about that, say that there does need to be a way to figure out how to keep news and things in print, from young people to us older ones that need to keep our brain a little active or more active as well. And so we do have to embrace the change with also trying to figure out a way to still support those that pick up the print.
There's also kind of an awkward incentive when it comes to the scoops, when it comes to the competitiveness aspect as well. I think all of us who have come from local journalism, as so much of Massachusetts kind of statewide journalism did derive from, realize that when we were all small, we really, really hated it when kind of the statewide organizations would basically pick up on a story that we did and then run with it as though they magically deduced it from the sky. And so all statewide organizations are dealing with this problem of how can you uplift or acknowledge local journalism? How can you cover those local stories responsibly without essentially eating the lunch of the smaller organizations? And we are absolutely still trying to figure that out after all of this time, but I think a very basic sort of small step that at least a lot of my friends in journalism really prioritize is make sure that if you did not deduce it from nowhere, at least credit and link to the smaller publications, because we're in online spaces now. It's easier to do than it ever was before. So I think small steps as reporters can kind of help bridge that gap, even though we don't have direct control over the funding.
Can I just piggyback on that? Being a small, you know how many people have taken the mayor, the governors, and Congresswoman Presley's clips, taken them off of YouTube, cited what they've said on my show, and not even put the hyperlink.
Without credit,
and so it triggered me a little bit, I'm sorry. But that is, so it's interesting to hear that you all deal with it. But yeah, that's happened to me often where someone will send me a link and, hey, you got cited, and I'm looking in the story, they'll say Java with Jimmy, but won't put a hyperlink. You know what I mean? And I think in this space, we understand the relevance of that. I thought what you were going to say was with the social media or the online versus print is also, there is this piece of getting the story out first. That I think in the evolution of how folks are getting their information, there is, when you talked about pressure, I think all of us, our entities and maybe us do deal with, well, I'll say me, I love to break news. I love for them to come on, and the first time, they're saying something is on Java with Jimmy, even though it might get snatched. There is a little bit, of that pressure as well, but when you name that, I just had to speak on that because it's happened often.
Real quick, one thing I hope you all do or you encourage your friends and family to do, it's a little hard because stories can be long. Even sometimes at Axios, some stories have a lot of bullet points. But I highly recommend that you just click on that hyperlink if someone's being credited and go to that original story, or if there's a local publication or a program. If you see Java with Jimmy on Instagram or YouTube or any sort of local presence, you have social media at your fingertips. You should be sharing those because people pay attention to that. That's, yes, advertising dollars online are not the same as print, but sharing those local stories and not just the Washington Post or the New York Times coverage of it goes a very long way.
Yes, right over here.
I think so.
Bob McGovern, I'm with CPCS Public Defender's Office. So I have a question about reports. How does what happens at the SJC, the appellate court, inform your coverage of what's happening at the State House? Matt, as you said, we're lucky to have State House News kind of serving and giving us information about everything that's happening at the State House, but unfortunately, outside of Mass Lawyers Weekly, there's no one doing the day-to-day at the SJC. There's no one doing the day-to-day at the appeals court. So how do you mix that into your beat to make sure that that is informing coverage of policy and politics?
I mean, I'll say I get every morning get the SJC and appellate court updates, and I click on links all the time. And the amount of time I put in reading opinions that I am not writing about is sort of criminal from what I've stolen from the Globe, money wise for my time. But no, it's a good point, and I think covering the State House and politics. I mean, there's definitely times where the SJC crosses my radar. I mean, I with Baker naming the entire court, I felt like I was writing about the SJC, but only about the people that were populating it, and not so much what opinions they were doing afterward. And I think it's when it crosses directly over into affecting what whether the legislature or someone is doing. I mean, those are the easy ones to cover. But I do think I do feel like there is more to do there, and more focusing on sort of the impact those different decisions have, because with the highest court, whether it's setting precedent or whatnot, it ripples across, and it ripples across the State House. And I think sometimes, yeah, maybe, unfortunately, maybe it gets lost in the mix. But yeah, I guess I could always say like, oh, I wish I was doing that coverage better. And because I think more about the stuff I don't cover than the stuff I do. I can't tell you what I wrote about yesterday, but I could tell you about all the stories I read that I wish I did. So yeah.
I think a lot of people don't really know, even on a local government level, what the SJC is doing on any given day, even though, of course, it impacts everything down to whether or not they should be dedicating city funds to a particular project. Often reporters have the responsibility not just of explaining these decisions and how, for instance, the legislature might be in a waiting game with the SJC over a particular policy and saying, well, we're not going to pass this law until the SJC has ruled on the underlying merits of this ballot measure. So that can be kind of a complicated thing if people are trying to figure out, hey, I haven't heard much about this topic in 2 years. Is anything still happening with that? And they don't realize it's kind of working its way through the courts. So again, it comes down to a bandwidth issue. I also, you get the court briefs. Law 360 is also useful if you're kind of trying to stay on top of it, but not everyone has access. But the balance of trying to cover SJC rulings as kind of an isolated incident, an isolated story, can be tricky because it can be very interesting to delve into a particular policy, and then again, you just lose the thread years later, and then suddenly have to go back and read all those opinions again and rewatch all of those oral arguments. So the court is just another thing that you're just constantly trying to keep up with the churn on.
Let's take one from over here.
If a comms professional is crafting a pitch for coverage, what gets your antenna up? Is it more, here's the story everyone's talking about, but here's the one angle they haven't touched on? Is it, here's the story that no one's talking about that deserves coverage? What gets your antenna up as far as what you think your limited capacity to?
I should say number one, especially if we're talking about metrics and SEO and things like that, but really it's the second one. And I don't think many people in this room who I've interacted with do this, but the worst thing is when someone's assigned to send out, maybe try to pitch their client as like an expert resource on a story, and they link to a story you wrote or a story that your competitors wrote, and it's kind of like, all right, the story's already out there. We're not just gonna, I know that it's their job to promote the CEO of this company or this law partner, but those are usually going to be the emails we turn down. So definitely things that are percolating but not yet have not yet made headlines. Love to hear those.
I would say both, because we're always looking for different angles, and if there's a different angle that somebody offers, we're interested in hearing about it. But I do have to say, and this is going to sound really shallow, but long emails are really deadly. Long press releases, because we get inundated with so many emails, and if you don't get to the point, if you have a preamble that goes on for 3 paragraphs, it's likely we're not going to make it to the actual point. So it just has to be written in a way that kind of grabs your attention right from the get-go.
That's such a good
I
one.
apologize for saying that, but it's true.
We call it TLDR, too long didn't read.
Yeah, write a good pitch like we try to write a good article. Like get to the point.
I would say in my case, be honest. Sometimes the awareness of the access that I have to certain populations, there are firms and there are people that reach out and say, hey, we want to get X CEO on your platform. And I'm fully aware that you got a budget in order to do this calm shopping around for this person. So also take that to consideration. I'm going to say this and I'm getting better at it. Support local platforms and entities, especially those of color, LGBTQ, marginalized. Y'all are getting a budget to shop around getting your client on. Say, hey, here's a media buy, rather than just, and so I think that's be honest. And my platform is a little bit different. I don't think they can come to y'all and say, hey, here's X amount of dollars to support your platform, run this story. Mine is a little bit different. And so honesty is the first thing, because don't try to sell me a pitch about this great CEO They may be doing great work, but I know what you have goals in order to go back to your client and say, hey, we booked you on 10, and one of them was this, community-centered platform.
Yeah, and timing is everything in journal. There's a day that I might have done a story that never would have normally gotten on the air, but something fell apart and I needed something, so I put it on the air. But yes, right here.
I just wanted to piggyback off of that, and it's a very quick question. Can you guys tell, just by reading a pitch, if it's come from a former journalist or not?
Yep.
What's the telltale sign?
The preamble in the email. No, honestly, yes, the super long ass email. Don't love it. But also, some of those former reporters know to try to call you or get to know you before they do those pitches. And they're also more honest in those emails, I can't tell you how many buzzwords are in some of those emails where I have to tell someone multiple times, sorry, we have to pass on this because I'm not, there's no news here. But yeah, so those 3 things I would say.
And, and if it's not in the pitch, it's in the responsiveness also. Prior to this job, I used to produce Greater Boston, the TV show, and we would be we'd be looking for guests for that day's show. And the difference, journalists, PR people who were former journalists automatically seemed to understand the deadline that we were under. So the responsiveness and sensitivity to deadline really is a tell.
All right, we're going to do one more question. This woman in the back, and then we're going to wrap it up.
Cindy Rowe from the Jewish Alliance for Law and Social Action, JALSA. A number of you mentioned equity as you were talking through your comments, and I'm wondering what obligation you feel to reach out to voices that are not your common sources and to dig deep to find organizations and people who represent an equitable voice and not just the usual folks you always go to.
So, go for it.
Oh, I was going to say earlier, Jimmy read the North Star vision for GBH, and I have to tell you, we feel a real tremendous responsibility to do that, and it's not just a responsibility, it's a mandate across the board that we need to reach out to people that we don't normally reach out to. So that's, anyone who's here, please reach out to us.
Can I chime in on that based on that North Star reading? I'm going to be very transparent, and the producers may get me. Going into GBH, I understood that I was going in more of a commentator. GBH has a whole political arm. And so what was said to me was, Jimmy, you won't do interviews with the elected officials when you're on GBH. And I was like, hold up. Wait a minute, where's the equity? That's not fair. I have access, and I want to interview them on GBH. And what the producer said to me, Annie S., what she said to me was, James, the equity that you speak of is actually in the stories of the people and organizations that are working toward equity every day. And so there is intentionality with this North Star piece, specifically to my platform on GBH, on regular Java with Jimmy. That's the essence of trying to find out who is working in equity. Yes, sometimes I get politician and community leader heavy, but there is that intentionality of seeking out who is doing the everyday work to bring equity to the quality of life, period.
Yeah, and I'll just add on that, during the pandemic, George Floyd, I started really thinking about the kinds of people I was talking to on a day-to-day basis, and there were a lot of old white guys, and there's nothing wrong with old white guys. I'm an old white lady, I guess, but
say it. Say it.
No, but and they were all excellent political analysts, by the way. But I really made an intentional. I'd call universities and I'd ask, do you have some, women that I could talk to, or some people of color that I could talk to, or whatever. And I really had to make it an actual point to do it. So I think it has to be, to your point, Jimmy, intentional. And yeah. Anyway, thank you all so much for being here. George, do you have a final word or? Oh, wow. Okay. Well, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much, all of you, for being here, for asking your wonderful questions and supporting the journalists here. And I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.